Story 1. I understand the frustration. For the most part, it is overhead bin space that fills more rapidly than seats. Moving backward while disembarking is difficult. There are probably other reasons. Story 2. The number of people who simply don't pay attention when given instructions is staggering. For instance, I know two of them very well. I call them Mom and Dad. Story 3. Other passengers in boarding group 5 are staking out spots at the front. Anyone with a carry-on should jockey for position if they do not want it moved to checked baggage. Story 4. I hate boarding first because I am tall, so less time on the plane is better. I also get frustrated when overhead bin space runs out because people with a suitcase and a bag take up most of it. Airlines seem really bad at policing carry-on luggage. Even when flying business class, I do not rush to board. Story 5. Can anyone explain why we do not board from the back and work forward? Serious question. Story 6. Planes are designed to take advantage of the last group of people. I do not like that people do this, but I understand why. Story 7. If you are at the front of group 5, you will have room for your carry-on. If you are in the middle or back, there is a good chance you will not. Story 8. I never used to. I was always one of the last to board because why would I want to spend more time in that tiny seat? Until once I boarded a flight and found a woman in my seat. It turned out they had given us both the same seat number, and I stood there thinking I was about to be thrown off the plane. Luckily, there was one spare seat. The check-in desk had messed up, so I made my way about 20 seats back, grumbling, and made the flight. Story 9. I'm not in line. There are not enough seats or places to stand within earshot of the gate announcements. Story 10. Airlines need to check carry-on luggage sizes so everyone who wants to use the overhead bin can do so. There are now more passengers, but bin space has not changed. It does not add up. The rules need to be recalibrated. Story 11. I wait for final boarding. There is no line, and I am in no hurry to take an even smaller, more uncomfortable seat. Story 12. As others have said, it seems to be a cascade effect. Airlines started charging more for checked baggage. People began bringing large carry-on suitcases plus a rucksack that is effectively a second carry-on. Overhead space fills quickly, so you either check your bag or it disappears into the cabin and delays you when deplaning. People therefore try to board as soon as possible, even if not in their boarding group, to secure space for their bags. Boarding groups are not strictly enforced by airline staff, so more people board early. Story 13. I am not going to let any of those Group 6 passengers take my overhead bin. Story 14. There is not enough overhead bin space. That is the only reason. Story 15. The real reason is that when airlines started charging high fees for checked baggage, everyone began bringing their belongings as carry-ons. If they do not get their carry-on into an overhead compartment first, they end up waiting longer for it at baggage claim. There is also an increased risk of lost baggage when it is sky-checked. I have lost 2 bags this way. Story 16. I need to find a spot for my bag in the overhead bin. Story 17. I am going to sit on my ass for a couple of hours. I will stand for as long as I can beforehand. Story 18. I get anxious. It's irrational. I try at least not to stand in the way of the line, but I like to be close by. Story 19. Anxiety. I hate flying, but sometimes I have to. I know it does no good, so I stand back from the gate and the line. Once boarding starts, I get an irrational urge to stand up. Story 20. It also does not help that people bring more than one carry-on onto the plane. Story 21. Airlines have it backwards. They should charge for carry-ons, not for checked bags. That would free up overhead bin space and make people less anxious about lining up. Pay for the seat and the overhead space. If you do not need the overhead space, someone else can pay for it. If you are not willing to pay, you can wait at baggage claim. Story 22. Because it is already hard enough to get down the aisle, now we have to fight everyone for the overhead luggage space. Great. Story 23. Shoot. I wait until the last call. Who wants to sit on the plane longer? 9 out of 10 times it is going to be hours on the plane. Story 24. They have not discovered the travel hack known as gate checking. Story 25. It is so annoying when people in boarding group 5 rush to line up as soon as boarding starts. They clog the aisles and delay things for everyone else. We all know it will take a while for the group to be called. So wait your turn. Trying to get ahead this way is pointless and only makes the process more stressful for everyone. Story 26. People in general are poor at listening and following rules. It is like herding cats. Story 27. The same people who stand right up against the baggage claim instead of a couple of steps back, preventing everyone else from seeing and grabbing their bags. Story 28. I don't care if I'm the last person to board. By then, most people have settled in. I get to check my bag for free because the overhead bin is full. My seat is reserved and I wait less time for takeoff and for coffee. Win. Story 29. Last week on a flight, I was in group 3 to board, and I had difficulty getting to the gate because the line was crowded. One man refused to move even when I loudly said, "Excuse me." I could have taken a different route, but I was annoyed, so I shoved past him. Story 30. My mom and dad do this. I do not understand why, but it annoys me. My mom said that it makes the airport experience more comfortable because she gets anxious. Story 31. They want the overhead storage that is directly above your seat, not theirs. Story 32. Oh my God. My wife needs to queue for the plane. I have no idea why. Despite my argument that boarding groups do not matter and we will all get our seats regardless of boarding order, she would rather stand in line. It must be a British thing. Story 33. How about the reverse? I used to wait until I was one of the last to board. I figured the plane was not leaving any sooner, so why not reduce my time in the cramped tube? Every time I did it, I would get the stink eye from the people in the seats next to mine. I understand wanting a free seat beside you and expecting it to remain open when it has been empty for most of boarding, but come on, I paid for it. People seem more entitled when flying. I eventually stopped doing this because people were unpleasant. Story 34. Flying has become unpleasant. Rude people and expensive, cramped seating. I am a petite 5'2" woman and feel claustrophobic in tiny seats. Each year the seating gets tighter. I hate how people block the gate when they have not been called, making boarding very inefficient. Story 35. If you have a small child but not small enough to qualify for priority boarding and you wait near the check-in counter, staff will sometimes wave you forward before it is your turn. This is not recommended, so please do not do it. I have seen it work many times. Join the queue with Group 1, pretend you do not understand the boarding announcements or any other language the staff use, and most of the time they will board you because it is less of a delay than sending you back. Story 36. Queuing. Never miss a chance to actually use the word with the most consecutive vowels properly. Story 37. That is one reason I avoid carry-on luggage. People lose their minds over carry-on space. I do not require it 99% of the time, and a small bag plus checked luggage works fine. Story 38. Are these the same people who stand up immediately after the airplane lands? Story 39. I had never flown alone as an adult and did not know how it worked. When I saw everyone lining up, I joined the queue. I wanted to sit and be the last one on board, but I was not confident enough yet, so I chose the safest option. Now I know for next time. Story 40. On airlines with assigned seating, I don't get the flipping point of boarding groups. It's maddening. Just board by consecutive rows. It's so easy. Goddamn. Story 41. I refuse to do anything related to boarding until there are only a few people left to scan their boarding passes. Then I go to the bathroom, fill my water bottle, and walk halfway down the jetway before running into the line. For deplaning, the opposite. I refuse to look up from my book until the row in front of me is actively moving. Then I get myself together and walk right out. It helps a lot to have a small backpack that fits under the seat and no rolling suitcase. Story 42. Many people are not used to flying, and many announcements are too quiet or cannot be understood. Generally, people do not listen to instructions. Story 43. I want to get on the plane and start farting because I hate people. Story 44. Personally, I resent that airplanes board by fare class rather than by what is actually efficient for everyone. Most of the time, Gate attendants will let you board even if you are a group or two early. Story 45. I do not want to have to check my bag. Often the first few people in boarding group 5 can find a spot, but the rest are left without one. Story 46. I would like to be first in line for the last group and request priority for the remaining overhead bin space. Story 47. I will play the old man and say it is likely people are not paying attention because they are on their phones, listening to music or podcast. They want to be first to avoid issues with the overhead bin, so they queue up as soon as the sign turns on. To summarize, people are inconsiderate. Story 48. I want to stand and stretch my legs a little before boarding the plane. Story 49. Anxiety. I think that if I do not stand up and get ready, I will accidentally miss it because I get distracted. Or I will not be ready and will hold up my group. I am not trying to get in the way, if that is what you mean. Story 50. I thought you actually called boarding group 8 because I am kind of drunk. I get anxiety while traveling, and sleeping through flights makes it a bit easier, so I walked up and realized that it was not my group yet. Now I am awkwardly standing here. Story 51. My wife has bad knees, so we sit and wait until the end of the line reaches the gate. It is not like you will get a better seat. Story 52. I do it for two reasons. First, I am impatient. What difference does it make where I wait? Second, I will be sitting in an uncomfortable airplane seat for hours, so I want to stand while I can. Standing is good for me. Story 53. I should not have to risk losing or waiting for my small travel duffel because other people buy huge roller suitcases that take up half the overhead compartment and call them carry-ons. Story 54. My favorite is the assholes who hover right where the line forms, blocking people from getting by. Story 55. Because people don't care. A me first then you mentality. Story 56. They have never seen an airplane before and cannot count. Story 57. This is connected to standing up when the plane arrives. For many people, they feel they must stand because their back is on fire. Mostly, in their youth, they did not allow themselves to process emotional trauma, and that trauma settled into their bones. Story 58. I've been waiting to board for several hours and I'm antsy. I arrived a couple of hours early in case of delays, and now I just want to go. Story 59. In my case, I was a tourist. The group was listed on my ticket and I had no idea what was going on. I asked staff at the gate if I was okay to board and they waved me on. I am used to announcements such as rows 15 to 30 board now, which are much clearer for everyone involved. Story 60. They are testing technology that prevents gate crowding. It emits an audible sound if you attempt to board before your group. Story 61. I am usually too nervous to wait patiently until I am seated on the plane. Story 62. On my most recent international flight, one of the gate attendants asked people who were not in the current boarding group to move back. I was impressed. Story 63. Filling planes from front to back is ridiculous. Creates a traffic jam. Being among the first to board means you spend the most time sitting on the aircraft, which is not a benefit unless you are in business class or first class. Story 64. I have always attributed it to inexperience. Those in later boarding groups are less likely to be frequent flyers, so when they hear the announcement that boarding is starting, they take it as an indication to get prepared, unaware that they are still 10 or more minutes from even getting in line. Story 65. Nobody is going to tell them to sit the fuck down and wait, so they dive in to avoid being stuck without space in the overhead bin and in a shitty middle seat. Story 66. I usually wait for my boarding group, or at least the one before it. If I have been sitting at the gate for a while on a longer flight, I sometimes get up to stretch my legs. To be fair, I stand back until called. Story 67. I rarely travel, so when I do I tend to make this kind of mistake. Airports make me nervous and my brain is unfamiliar with the procedures. Story 68. Carry-on size limits must be enforced, and overhead bin space should be reserved for each seat. Story 69. So someone does not take the overhead space for your carry-on luggage. Story 70. You should be first on the plane in group 5, or all the overhead baggage space will be gone. The best way is to line up. Story 71. Aim to be at the front of the group. The sooner you board, the better your chance of getting luggage space near your seat. Story 72. I don't know. I take that as my opportunity to get one last pee in. Story 73. I definitely read this too fast and thought you said queefing. That's a very different question. Story 74. My ex-wife did this. She got it from her dad. You have to be ready 10 minutes before anything happens. Neither of them had nefarious intent. Story 75. Gate lice. It's like when you fly Southwest and people in Group B or Group C stand at the front of the line instead of waiting their turn. They think the gate agent is magically going to scream, "Boarding all groups now." Story 76. I just like to sniff the people in Group 1 before they get on. It is intoxicating. Story 77. For me, it's mostly about moving around before I sit on a flight for however long. Story 78. I do not get in the way of previous groups, but I stand and pay attention because they sometimes move quickly from one group to another, and I do not want to slow things down. I do not understand why people line up when it is not their turn. Story 79. I blame boarding group. Story 80. You already know you are in the last group, but you do not want to be the last person. Story 81. I like to stand in lines close to strangers. Do not judge. Story 82. Look at this rich bitch. I thought there was a maximum of group 5. What the fuck? Story 83. How about no carry-on items that you cannot place under your seat? Story 84. I have anxiety, and it settles when I am seated on the plane. Lining up calms it a bit too because it feels like progress toward the goal. Story 85. They are anxious to move on to the next part of their trip. Story 86. Sometimes I have been sitting for 1 to 3 hours. I want to get up. I am standing and waiting. That is fine. Story 87. I just get bored of sitting, especially when I am about to sit for another 3 to 5 hours. It is nice to get up and stretch my legs. Story 88. I have been sitting for an hour and will be sitting for another hour or more on the plane. Getting up to stand in line early is probably good for me. Story 89. I need to get my items in the overhead bin before they make me check them, because someone brought a drum set and an adult llama as carry-on luggage. Story 90. I want to find space for my bag in the overhead bin. Story 91. Probably the same people who stand up as soon as the plane lands. Story 92. Although the overhead bin space is intended for suitcases of 8 kilograms, you will often find inconsiderate passengers placing jackets and small bags there. As a result, you may have no space for your belongings. Sometimes flight attendants ask people to remove those items, but on one occasion I was forced to check my bag because other passengers wanted to store extra items overhead. Story 93. The issue isn't just people bringing one carry-on. It's those who stuff the overhead bins with their carry-on and personal item, leaving no space for others. They feel entitled to extra overhead bin space to avoid using their underseat storage and cramping legroom. Story 94. They are not trying to beat the people in groups 1 through 4. They are trying to beat the other travelers in group 5 for overhead bin space. Story 95. Probably a unique experience. The last time I was at Memphis International Airport, it was confusing. 2 planes were boarding at the same time. One airplane across the terminal was boarding Zone 3, and we were boarding for SkyMiles members at the very beginning. The other plane's announcements were quieter, and they used a different flight number. If you were paying attention, you could tell where each flight was boarding, but I understand how it could be confusing. Story 96. I have a friend who uses it as a self-regulation tool. They can calmly take their seat and put on headphones before most of the ruckus begins. I think it is a good idea for anxious flyers unless they have been called to board by seat number, of course. Story 97. Some of it may be due to the appalling public address systems in airports, where you cannot understand a word. Story 98. Waiting in line is not much different from waiting somewhere else. I am not a very experienced flyer and I have a lot of social anxiety, so I try to be ready to board as soon as I can. Story 99. I get up and stand in position as soon as boarding group 4 is called. This is not an excuse. Overhead bin space is often taken by people not in your row. Story 100. They are cheap bastards who brought all their baggage as carry-ons. They need to get there first to take up all the space in the overhead compartments. Story 101. Dude, I do not think the people who could answer this question can actually read. Hence the problem. Story 102. Usually a friend of mine is in an earlier group. I will just follow him. Worst case, they tell me to wait until my group is called. Best case, they let me board despite standing in the wrong boarding group. Story 103. Just to stretch my legs a bit. I usually get up, start walking, and use the restroom around the time they ask for people who need assistance. Story 104. Tired of sitting around? It's time to stand. Story 105. I'm doing it wrong. I travel with only a backpack. At the gate I relax, watch a movie, or play my Steam Deck. After most passengers have boarded, I stroll to the counter, get my boarding pass scanned, and take my assigned seat. On arrival, once most passengers have disembarked, I walk off, go to baggage claim, collect my bag, and leave. Story 106. I think it is just a dogmatic response when people hear anything related to the flight. People claim priority simply because they are on the flight. Story 107. I do not do this, but I suspect I know why people do. It is largely due to competition for overhead bin space, but it is also a psychological factor caused by the anxiety of getting up, leaving the house, fighting traffic, finding the gate, and making the flight on time. People are psychologically vulnerable and display their anxieties through their behavior. Gate agents also tend to suspend rules when stressed. They often take the path of least resistance by not confronting passengers and giving in to pressure to keep flights on time, so the issue must be addressed automatically. Kudos to American Airlines for rolling out automatic blockers that detect passengers boarding outside their group. Story 108. I'm laughing loudly. Really, why? The same goes for the people in the last row who run down the aisle before row 1 can unfasten their seatbelts. There is a process to deplane. Story 109. The number of times the same question has been asked and answered is ridiculous. It is not rocket science to figure this out. Story 110. I am lucky enough to fly first class on most flights, and I am almost always the last person off the plane. Story 111. This is me when I travel with my family. I am sorry, when I travel alone, I wait until it is my turn, but my family gets so desperate that they drag me along. It is embarrassing. Story 112. I have only ever been on one flight where the boarding order was strictly enforced. Story 113. Air travel has become a stressful experience. Reading these comments explains why. Story 114. A lot of people who line up early are anxious flyers. That is not a good excuse, but it is the truth, and we could all use more compassion. Many people complain about this. If it matters that much, by all means take your place in line when you are called. But realize that becoming angry over such trivial things is petty. Look around. The world is in shambles. We treat each other poorly more often than kindly. This kind of behavior contributes to that. I do not care if you downvote me. You all need to give your heads a shake. Except for the man who was late for the funeral and could not bring his bags. Sir, I am truly sorry for your loss. Story 115. Group 5 has its own boarding lane, and I am not hurting anyone by doing so. Story 116. I take anti-anxiety medication for flights. The sooner I get to my seat, the sooner I can take it. That gives me more time to settle in. Story 117. I take my time, but I usually fly first class, so I am in an early boarding group, not for snobby reasons. I am overweight, and I can either buy 2 regular tickets or 1 first-class ticket for maybe $50 more. I choose first class because I get better service, and I always pick the aisle seat so I can raise the armrest and have a wider seat. I am also disabled and need the wide seat because I have chronic swelling with no cure, so I could even board before first-class passengers, but since I am on the aisle, I am not in a rush to get to my seat. Another reason I choose first class is that airlines sometimes assign the 2 reserved seats to other passengers or separate them from mine, so my reservation does not work out. Plane seats are uncomfortable, so in reality I usually board after group 5, but mentally I feel I have to board early since I am in an early group. My only guess why someone in group 5 would board early is that planes are sometimes double booked and people want to claim that seat first. forcing the other passenger to hope for an open seat or take the next flight. This is especially true if you are flying with a connection and the connection time is only about a 30-minute layover with gates at opposite ends. That situation requires both flights to be on time, and delays can cause missed connections. I would say this is rare, but it is not. Story 118. I do not want to be the second to last person to find out that my carry-on bag must be placed in the cargo hold. Story 119. I do not care if it is 8, 1, or 5. I relax as long as possible before getting on the plane. Who wants to spend that much time in cramped conditions? I am 6 feet 5 inches tall, which is 195 centimeters, and I want to be in the seat as little as possible. Story 120. Follow-up question. Why do people stand up immediately after a vehicle parks, exposing their rear end to other passengers? Story 121. I have boarded early because they do not always check tickets. Many gate attendants simply scan the boarding pass to verify that it is valid for the flight. If they check the boarding group, I apologize and wait for my group to be called. Story 122. I do not want to be the last person forced to check my bag, because that would add another half hour to my trip when I land. Story 123. Honestly, who gives a shit when you board a plane? It is leaving at the same time. Story 124. I have consistently boarded 2 to 3 groups early to make sure I get my carry-on in an overhead bin. I have never had a gate worker tell me to wait for my assigned group. I am not sure whether they do not know or do not care, but I am a wild man who cannot be tamed. Story 125. I always have a window seat. It makes sense for me to go slightly ahead of my group. I am not trying to be first in line. Story 126. They're selfish assholes. Isn't that the obvious answer? Story 127. Not sure if I commented already, but my biggest problem is this. If you are in boarding group 5 and then have to check your bag for a layover, you try to be first in group 5 before the attendant says, "We are out of space in the overhead bins." My solution, which seems stupidly simple, is to board passengers with assigned seats from the back of the plane forward to avoid the chaos over who checked in first. They could still allow military personnel, people with disabilities, and families with young children to pre-board, but back-to-front boarding would save time. To make it work, airlines might reserve some space in the forward overhead bins for last-minute carry-ons, but streamlining boarding seems like a basic problem. Story 128. Oh my God. Literally me. I just have to make sure my bag gets overhead space. I cannot risk it ending up in cargo. Plus, standing in line gives main character vibes, you know? Story 129. Checking your baggage is like donating everything in it to the airline, and unless I can deduct it from my taxes, it isn't worth it. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.